We're continuing in our series of 11, count them 11, Vancouver ridings that we're exploring for the May 9th provincial election. We've been fortunate, I think, with the generous time of candidates in this campaign to spare us about a half hour to talk about the issues that are in their ridings, some of their personal issues as well as they approach public life and what their ambitions are for their ridings in the province. This half hour, we're going to talk about the Vancouver-Hastings riding. And Shane Simpson, who's the MLA for the NDP, seeking re-election, is with me. And David Wong is the candidate for the Green Party, and he's also seeking election. Jane Spitz, the Liberal candidate, declined to appear, and we're sorry about that, but more airtime for both of you. So good to have you both here. Thanks a lot for coming in.
Good to be here, Kirk.
Listen, let's talk a bit about why people want to do this in the early going. David, I'll put you as the newcomer on the block on this one. What is it that you're trying to do?
Well, this is a neighborhood I was born and raised in. My ancestors actually set up a home over here in this actual part of the world.
Oh, yeah?
I'm running because you know what they say, you can't complain unless you vote. And I've been complaining for a long time. And
you could have just voted, though, David.
Well, I remember my grandpa telling me, we... a community I'm associated with the Chinese Canadians. We served for Canada. My ancestors did, and we've been voting every single year. And I'm still complaining, but nothing seems to change. So it's time for me to run for office and rattle the cage from inside Victoria.
Shane Simpson, I think you and I met when I was back at the Vancouver Sun, and you were doing community work. You were representing. It was pre-public life, so you would have had to encounter somewhat the same questions that David now is approaching. But what is it that makes you want to continue to have this sort of commitment to public life? What makes you want to be an MLA?
Well, I've been elected since 2005 for 3 terms, and it's a huge privilege to serve the people of Vancouver-Hastings. I grew up in East Vancouver. I started my political activism probably as a kid. I grew up in Raymer Housing Project over at Campbell and Hastings with my mom and my sister on welfare. And I learned about welfare rights. I learned about inequality there. I learned about the militant mothers of Raymer and a wonderful story that I'm sure you've probably told on this station before. And my commitment to public service and to social justice happened there, and it's evolved. And I was fortunate enough to be elected in 2005. And I see it as a huge privilege, and I'm particularly excited this time because I've spent 12 years in opposition, and if I'm fortunate enough to be reelected, I do hope it will be as part of a John Horgan government where I get to implement some of the things that are important to me.
Well, I want to hear from both of you about what you are hearing as you knock on doors, as you greet people on the street, as the campaign gets more and more aware, I think, in the public mind, because people don't all lock into the idea that there is a campaign going on. David, what are you hearing in the riding about the priorities for people here, what their aspirations are, whether government is letting them down somehow? Tell me a little bit about what the tone is out there.
Well, the biggest frustration we hear is the housing and the affordability. They're excited to hear that I'm an architect. I've been doing affordable housing all over the world for the last 20 plus years, and I'm involved with coastal First Nations communities. When they talk about housing and affordability, it's more than just housing, a roof over their head. It's also everything that's connected to it. Jobs. I was at the bookstore on Commercial Drive. A fellow's telling me that I'm gonna move away from here because I'm getting kicked out of my basement suite. And same thing. I walked down the street and other people said, no, I can't afford to live here anymore. So that's the biggest concern from people in Vancouver-Hastings. And they're excited to hear that, I am an architect, which means they think that I have some new ideas. I'm not a career politician, so they're very excited to say, okay, we might have some fresh voice, fresh ideas.
Shane Simpson, I would imagine that affordability is one of the biggest words that someone learns to spell very young in a city like this right now. Is that the prime issue that you're hearing out there?
Well, affordability is a huge issue, and I've been hearing that for the last couple of years. It's been driven in my office. Probably more people came through the door of my office to talk about things like the housing crunch. These are young families often who aren't talking about purchasing because that's just not in their reality right now, certainly not in the city of Vancouver. but they've got a $50,000 a year income or so, a couple of kids, and they're saying, I'm trying to find a 3-bedroom that I can rent, and I can't find one that's appropriate. And when I do find it, it's $1,000 or $1,500 more a month than I can afford. And that's the crunch. So you hear that about housing. But we're hearing other things. The other things that I think are probably the strongest issues that I'm hearing are around education. There's a big concern around education. We got a lot of inner city kids, right. And we got a lot of crunch. And people particularly feel an anxiety around that in Vancouver because, as you'll know, the provincial government fired the elected school board, appointed a trustee, and that trustee is making decisions that a lot of people feel are pretty arbitrary. They just, ended funding for adult education the other day, ABE, adult basic education.
Would the NDP essentially reignite?
We will return an elected board, and there's two options. One would be to hold by-elections. The other would be to reinstate the duly elected, the people who were elected.
Which way do you think you'd lean?
Well, that decision is not entirely resolved. My inclination is to reappoint the board. They were elected, and if the voters don't like them, the voters will throw them out in 2018.
Yeah.
But I don't think you throw a board out because you have a political difference with them. And frankly, I haven't seen what the other difference is. The one other thing that is very key to people right now that I hear a lot is the fentanyl situation.
Sure.
And the opioids.
Yeah.
And just hearing from people, we had what they report 160 deaths last month. And it's not for lack of effort on the part of first responders and others. It's just an incredibly challenging issue that we need to get our heads around.
David Wong, in running for the Greens, we had Andrew Weaver here just the other day, and this is obviously the election in which the Greens are trying to assert themselves in a far wider way, to not really just be associated with issues involving the environment and issues involving climate change. And the party's put out a very extensive policy, and I know you would know it now inside out. One of the areas I think is around education. You've made a pretty large commitment, a commitment that actually even exceeds some of the things that the NDP is putting on the table around either spending or early childhood education. But what would you see as the priorities around education for a community like this, and particularly for a riding like yours, which has its own economic challenges in particular?
Well, the first thing that we look at Vancouver-Hastings is that we have to reflect on what has just occurred in the last year and a bit. They were going to close on 19 schools in Vancouver, 18 of them on the east side of Vancouver. So what does that tell you? It reflects on the preference in certain areas of our city, areas of our province. So it's really unfair. So we need a voice out here that actually speaks on behalf of the people
to prevent the school closures, or to think through how to use those buildings, or what exactly?
To think through what exactly they're doing, because the most precious thing for people is education. And I was at a school, Laura Secord, and one of the young persons there asked the question, what is the biggest priority for you, and what would you do? I said, well, it's education, because education is something that you get, and it never leaves you. A house or a job, you might lose that. But education, once it's invested in a person, it's there with you forever. So we look at education. The BC Greens are very strong. Our platform is fully costed, and it's the number one priority. You look at education. A fifth of our candidates are educators, school board trustees, teachers, professors. Dr. Weaver, our leader there, he's actually a PhD Nobel Peace-winning scientist. It's amazing.
He won the Nobel Prize?
He's on I don't know the exact terminology, but he is a Nobel Prize.
I know he's a prominent scientist. I'm not sure he's a Nobel winner.
It's a Nobel something. I don't know.
Okay.
I have to check that, but it's
okay.
Okay.
So Shane, in a couple of minutes that we have left in this segment, we'll have another one after the break. The education piece has been obviously very fundamental. It's been also a crucible, I think, for a great deal of dispute with the current government. Obviously, it lost the Supreme Court decision rather handily in order to deal with class size and all of this. What's the vision for the education system under an NDP government? What would be really markedly different about it? Because we're getting decent test scores. We're getting, in a lot of ways, some of this funding restored that might have been there for the last 15 years. What would be different in your case?
Well, I think there's a couple of challenges. we're seeing the role of schools that they play in children's lives, I think, is evolving. I think they continue to play an increasingly large role, particularly in a constituency like Vancouver-Hastings. You're seeing increasing times where parents are spending more time having to work. You got two-parent families working. The role of schools is evolving, and I think we need to figure out how to support that in a better way.
When you say it's evolving, is there just a different dynamic between the parent and the class?
Well, I think that's changing. I think that the role that technology is playing is changing education. I think that the complex situation, we're seeing more kids who are vulnerable. In our community, certainly in Vancouver-Hastings, where the school plays a role of stabilizing role in their lives, and that has to happen. One of the things that we've talked about, and nobody wants to do another Royal Commission, we've done that, but we really need to have a conversation about how schools are funded. The current funding formula is a per pupil formula. I understand why we've done that. It's the simplest way to structure funding in a complex envelope.
So should
portfolio.
There be tiers of formulas?
Well, maybe we should be talking about envelopes that dedicated to certain aspects of education where the funding is there. We should be talking about how we do that funding. But the challenge is we have to get all of the players at the table to have that conversation. And as you'll know, for 15 years, there's been a war between teachers and this Christy Clark, largely, who was the education minister, who in fact started this. And it's very hard to have that discussion when there's no trust. So the first thing is to sit down with a sense of trust and be able to do that work. And that's where we're beginning. Let's
take a break here at Roundhouse Radio 98.3. We're talking to Shane Simpson. He's the NDP MLA for Vancouver-Hastings, and one of his challengers in this election is David Wong of the Greens. We're continuing our conversations about Vancouver ridings here this week on the station. So stay with us here. We'll be back after this.